Greetings, friends.
My name is Steve Kelsey.
And I'm Ron Leota, and this is The Roles We Play, the show about the roles we play in the games we love. On the show today, we're talking a little bit about adding some hot sauce to your game. We're going to go over some GM tricks of the trade. Without further ado, let's start the show. All right, so I am a gigantic fan of making tabletop role-playing games interesting. As a audio nerd, I absolutely adore building audio props for games to kind of enhance them. So the show today is about kind of, like I said, adding some hot sauce to your game, taking your current tabletop game and kind of elevating it to the next level, having some cool little additions that make the game a lot more fun. So yeah, that's why I'm immediately rambling about audio, because frankly, I love having a custom soundtrack and maybe some sound effects to spice up a game. What's one of your favorite go-tos for making a game a little spicy?
Well, I always want to start with audio because that's a really easy and essentially free way to really spice up a game. And then I fail miserably at being consistent with that. And so that's on me. So I actually live in a world where I want things in the game to be things that I don't think that the players have ever done before or would think that they're going to do within the mechanics of the game that they have. And so that is really like all of my spice up stuff, and all of my notes here are related to sort of like running it in the campaign, though I do have some thoughts on things that I haven't done. So understand this is me not practicing what I preach, but that I think would definitely enhance a game that are relatively affordable, like full sets, costumes, of course, makeup, hiring a couple local improv actors to come in and add some play as NPCs, you know, those easy things. No, that's none of my suggestions. They're going to be related to that. But yeah, so audio is the one that I wish that I practiced better, but I just don't. I always have like songs. I have a playlist. I build it, and for like the first few sessions, I'm super on it, and then I abandon it, like a forgotten pet, and it starves in the corner. Because music's important to me in a world. It sets the tone. But then after I set the tone, I no longer continue with the tone. And that's me being a bad GM.
See, I like to...
So talk to me a little bit more about your audio cues. Because you mentioned, I think a lot of people have done like, this is the soundtrack, here's the battle music, here's the kind of like in-world music. Mm-hmm. But talk to me more about this sound effects thing. You actually cue up like sound effects or like background noise for it?
Yeah. So my favorite... So yeah, I do have like a set of 4 or 5 just ambient playlists of music. Like, here's your walking about town music, here's your battle music, here's your tense scene music, sort of thing. But beyond that, I really like there's a couple of YouTube channels that exclusively do free tabletop role-playing sound effect tracks. So you can go online, you can find these things, and it's great. Like, I'll use one that's like, if they're going to be in a cave, I put on a dark, dank cave sound effect track, and all as it is just that kind of hollow sound blowing and the occasional drip with a loud echo, and that's all it is. But that little bit of ambient sound really draws people in. Like if I'm doing something sci-fi, there's going to be an engine hum going on if you're on a spaceship. And I remember running a big sci-fi campaign, and even though I did probably something nutty like 50 audio props for that one, people said the one that stuck out to them the most was, as soon as we ended the session and I killed the ambient hum of the engine, like everybody felt weird. Like it had become just so second nature. And then they were like, it's bizarre how that kind of played into me getting into character. I do queue up occasional sound effects for really big beats in a scene. Like if I know like I'm running horror and I'm going to do a jump scare. I have been known to hide speakers in my house that are right behind my players, and have those on Bluetooth, so I can just click a nice button on my phone, and all of a sudden there's a scream directly behind them. Fair warning for anybody who ever plays any of my horror campaigns, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, just having a queued up sound effect, I find it's minimalism. I don't need like to go ridiculously over the top. I have, and that can be fun. But just having 3 queued sound effects, like I remember I had a villain that they were going to meet him and he was going to have a very casual villain conversation while sharpening his sword, just menacingly sharpening it. And so I had the sound of a sword being sharpened playing the entire time, and I was doing the physical motion of it. And they were like, it was so much more off-putting for you to have that sound playing while you were doing it than anything you could have explained or could have described. So stuff like that. I like I like a music sound, I like a soundtrack, I like a ambient sound for wherever you are, and then I also like having maybe 2 to 4 sound effects a session, and that alone has gotten me by being called a good GM.
Yeah.
Even though I'm like, I kind of ran a bad game, they're like, that was amazing. And I'm like, was it? Well, okay.
So for those of us that don't use all of Ron's cheats, which by the way, how do I get into one of these tabletop games where I get sound effects and everything? I assume post quarantine.
Post quarantine, sir, you are absolutely welcome. I have a number of one shots I am dying to run for people that actually kind of require people being in the room with me, because of the amount of production that goes into some of them. I will so have you in on that, and I might even have you bring a camera along.
I'm 100% in on this. Other things that you can do that are kind of room or like area based, and you can do these on streaming things, but it's like, well, we're all in the quarantine, but it's much better in the room. D&D and tabletop are like in general, any kind of RPGs, much like board games, are usually better in the room. You can do lighting. A lot of people have hue lighting now in their houses, or like different Wi-Fi app lighting, so you can kind of preset that up. So if you're in like a battle or conflict, you can change that to kind of a red, orange color. If you're in like a calm thing, you can do like a daylight, nighttime lighting and stuff like that. That's really fun. And doesn't require a lot. You can find those little like Bluetooth or Wi-Fi type light systems for relatively cheap if you're kind of a serious gamer, and you run a lot of campaign type stuff. The other thing you can do is you can have props. Again, don't spend a bunch of money at these, but like secondhand stores and costume stores have this stuff for free. So feel free to have a prop. It seems cheesy at first, like you're a second trade teacher trying to get kids into history. But in reality, I think that it really kind of adds for the players. If you're doing a voice and you're wearing a hat, you've got like their weapon in your hand. It also helps you get into character a little bit more. This is the kind of stuff that can really help kind of add like a little bit more flavor. The other thing I saw somebody do, and I can't believe that they did this, but it ended up being super cool, is rather than doing like a playmat situation, because they didn't have a bunch of miniatures and a bunch of like little things that they could build their table off of, they were very much just narrative combat and stuff like that. Is that they actually went and got a big giant like poster board, like a display board, and they took 2 just giant foam boards and did both sides of them, so they actually kind of arted up their own background. And then when they would narrate behind them as a GM, they would just like, if you switch scenes, they just stand up and go and flip the board and sit back down, and that would be what you would be in. So it was almost like having an image there. Image work and sharing your desktop and stuff like that are great for over the internet campaigns, over Discord, over Skype. And so that's one that is super easy on the remote side. That's much easier than, say, a campaign itself in the room. where you can go and you can either have made your map or made your or have your scene set. Again, even if you don't use grids, even if you're not using that kind of crunchier form of combat and you're keeping it loose, having a picture of the tavern, having stuff. And if you're not streaming, if you're not like doing it anywhere, Infinite Art Online, even if you are, there's a bunch of services that that you can use to kind of get your players into it. So that's a thing that I've learned in quarantine that I never did in the room. I wouldn't like grab a bunch of images of a tavern. I would just sort of like share out an image on the Discord earlier before session and be like, this is what I'm thinking about for this. This is like they enter a tavern at the end of a session, or they enter a cave, or they enter a mansion. And I'm like, here's a couple pictures of what this looks like. But they're not like looking at it at the time versus like a shared in session like Discord or Skype or Zoom chat where they're literally looking at screens all the time. So you can really punch that up with imagery.
Yeah, and I mean, digital props are really great. I mean, having something physically to interact with is a lot of fun and surprisingly brings people in. But just having images, I tend to have a big screen up in my living room, so I will use that to have a map constantly up for people to see. And when I need to show an image of something like, oh, you happen upon this strange drawing, and then I'll put that up on the screen or whatever. So people have a central place to look. One of the best uses I've ever seen of a central screen in a room, my brother Gabe did, and I all props to him because I have stolen and used this idea many a time since he did it. He was running a Shadowrun campaign, and in Shadowrun there are individuals that they refer to as Mr. Johnson. It's the polite term for your employer. You only ever refer to them as that name. That way it's all anonymous. So our characters were meeting up with our Mr. Johnson to get the work, the contract for the corporate espionage we were going to do. And I remember Gabe's fixer character was like, all right, sit down, shut up. He's beaming in. And he just turns on his screen, and unbeknownst to us, he had a friend of his, backlit and shadowy on Skype, who was our Mr. Johnson.
Ooh.
And we directly interacted with an individual on the screen. He had that friend who lived out of town come in, usually on average twice or so a session, and he had different hats and different costumes he would put on, and when we would call a contact or something, he had this friend who was helping him GM the game by being these 2 or 3 NPCs, and having that was just, we were all just, we're so
that is pro as fuck right there. That is like an event experience. I joked about bringing in actors to play NPCs, but that is a top shelf experience.
And when you said that, though, I wanted to be like, oh my gosh, you can actually do that. Just get a nerd friend of yours that lives far out of town, but you really miss gaming with, and be like, hey, every other Tuesday or so, you think it could be free for 30 minutes?
Yeah, and just like, you can have them integrated if they're like me, where they just enjoy listening to D&D or listening to tabletop in general, any kind of RPG. They'll just sit there during the session, so they could just pop in whenever, kind of thing. That's freaking amazing. Well, I'm gonna go to simpler things, which is my hot sauce tips for things to do in the campaign itself and in how the campaign is played that you should be thinking about as a GM. And I'm going to use, because I'm running 2 5th ed campaigns, 2 5th ed D&D campaigns right now. So that's where my head is at. That's what I was listening to for like the last month straight. So that's kind of where I'm at. But this is applicable to anything. You just have to change the systems a little bit. The first thing you should be always looking at for when you want to surprise your players is taking and looking at the skill sets that they have, the rules that they're working in the case of D&D, their skill checks and everything, and their combat and their AC, and taking that out of combat and into something else. This can be a challenge for performance. To bring this back into video games a little bit, for anyone that's played Final Fantasy VI or Final Fantasy VII or Final Fantasy or a lot of like RPGs, the early Fallouts did this, taking the skills and applying them as a series of like initiative or turn-based skill checks and successes, where they can take like damage or struggle to succeed or fail at something, like an opera or a dance presentation or a shooting a porn in the case of Fallout. Just doing that in a way where you still have them roll initiative, you still have them in the mindset of strategizing to accomplish the goal. So they're using their toolkits to solve the problem, but the problem is not kill the monster or stop the bandit or hack the system. It's a almost mundane by comparison problems. It really makes it feel like a player involved combat without actually doing combat, and it always works well because it adds for role play, but it keeps them in the strategy space, and it gives you a story beat that they did, or something that they did in the campaign that wasn't just a role-playing moment, but was something still defined by chance or, preparedness of strategy, which is, I always think, is kind of cool. So the one that I just listened to, shout out to NADPOD for this, is in their bonus campaign they had a like a trials round, and they had just had one in the previous one that was very combat focused. So I was like, wow, trials round again. But this one was, they were on essentially a cooking show, like a Great British Bake Off kind of thing. And they had to do like a history check for knowing the recipe, and then a performance check for presentation, and a sleight of hand check for effectively doing the recipe right. And then they added those together, and there was different levels of point totals that would allow them to roll damage on the judge, where they're not really hitting them. They called it flavor damage. And it was all very jokey, and it was all very fun, because that's what that podcast is supposed to be. But it was such a fun way to do like a trials thing without actually having any real combat. And if they failed, then the judge would throw up acid vomit on them, and that would do damage to their character. So it was really warping D20, which is a very combat-based system. Dungeons & Dragons is very combat-heavy. Warping it into something that was like combat, sort of, but really just let's have fun doing this with your character skills and levels that you've earned by playing this game. So that's a good example of like something like that.
Yeah, so this one only works for like multi-session campaigns, but so kind of a thing you can do without having to do a bunch of build crazy wacky things. You can I call it time to shine. Giving each, we talked a little bit about this last week, kind of hinted at, but I like every so often writing a specific adventure or story beat based entirely around a particular character's skill set. The main issue is you have to be very careful to balance that for everyone, and sometimes you don't ever write one for particular characters. If you have a character, for instance, that shines all the time because they're the combat guy and combat happens a lot, you don't need to write something special. But if you have somebody who took all the time to do social skills or crafting skills, writing a adventure where they get to shine, I think is super important. And you talked a bit about that as well. It's just, I don't know, man, like allowing a player to feel special for something that tabletop role-playing games take for granted, like cooking or dancing or singing or this and that, I think is awesome. And that really spices a game up, because surprisingly few GMs give any consideration to what they consider mundane tasks, and how much of our actual lives are dictated by mundane tasks.
Yeah, exactly. One of the big things that I am trying to integrate into the streaming campaign I do for Dying of Exposure is, because one of my players couldn't make a session, I decided to separate their character from the group. It was actually a good narrative time for it to happen, so it was fine. And then I separately got on with them, and we did like an hour and a half long session where I played what they were doing while the other party was doing, which sort of naturally baked that mentality in. So I had a solo session. You can see that in episode 4.5 of Through the Mill on Dying of Exposure's YouTube, youtube.com/Dying of Exposure. It's called Trapper's Big Day, because that player couldn't make the session, but it's a streaming session. So unless like half my party can't come, I kind of got to run it. And I've just got to figure out what I'm doing. Otherwise, people are like, hey, you weren't on Twitch last week at the time you say you are. And so I did like a little bonus section. And so especially in this time of pandemic, it's real easy to set up a call with like one player or two players if you have like a group campaign. Especially if you have a bigger group, like 5 or 6 players, where you can be like, this is about you. And it helped me as a GM learn their character better and how they would react to things. And it helped them as a player learn their character better and how they would react to things. And it made a lot of the things that you're talking about, this time to shine moment, and taking into consideration each of your players who's spent time because they want to be a master artisan, or they want to be, you know, a pop singer or something like that. And really like bring that home. That's what you're doing right now. It's just them. But also having it in a group setting really gets the group in that mentality, I think, of sharing the spotlight. Like, the combat character is just not good at these things. They're not going to be the one to make the big wins on this. And just reminding people that they need to make space for each other without directly doing it, with just doing it in the narrative. It's a good tip. It's a good tip. Time to shine is a very good thing. Planning your sessions around who that session or what that session's narrative is kind of about and who it should apply to is a big key in a good it's a good spice to add to your GM planning every time you're sitting there. Is like, okay, this isn't just a broader concept. Who does this story affect the most? What player background am I tying into this story? That kind of stuff.
So I wanted to share a couple of things I've done in past campaigns to spice things up, as hopefully a way to inspire people for their own super cool ideas, or just steal these. It's totally fine with that. So a couple of my favorites, I ran a Star Wars campaign, and before each session, I would make a crawl. I would get out, I'd hop on my little laptop I had. I used Windows Movie Editor, and I just had a floating star background, and there was the Star Wars crawl with the iconic music, and every time it would kind of give them where we last left our heroes. And that, I noticed, immediately got everybody 100% out of, all right, we're here, we haven't seen each other in a while, let's chit chat and have fun, into we're playing the game. Yeah. The game's on. The music
movie
happened.
Is started.
John Williams told us.
Time to play.
Yeah. Another one I really enjoyed was a time we accidentally tabletop role-played. So we were all playing Artemis Bridge Simulator, which is a really, really fun game if you like Star Trek or spaceships. Yeah. And everybody has their own computer, which is their workstation. And you all cooperate to take on missions in space and whatnot. We found ourselves very quickly starting to roleplay. And then we started coming up with characters. And about 2 hours into playing multiple scenarios, we realized, holy shit, are we just running a tabletop campaign using a computer game? And we were kind of like, yeah, we kind of are. And it turned into this hybrid video game tabletop thing. So it's an example of using a thing you already have access to and infusing role-playing into it. You have things you can infuse roleplay into, and that in and of itself is a tabletop thing. Another example I'll use is so I wanted to have a gambling scene where everybody was on a riverboat, and I wanted to have a crooked card dealer. So I actually learned a little tiny bit of sleight of hand. Yep. I learned 2 tricks and got really good at them. And then when I started to play, I said, everybody, just so you understand, everything I am doing right now is happening in game. So from the moment we establish game is on, this is all happening in game. I'm the card dealer that I set it up. And then we went and I actively used sleight of hand, and I wasn't great at it. So after a couple times, people started to catch me, and they're like, "Well, can I call him out?" Of course you can.
Yeah.
What do you think you saw? And then I had them roll to confirm what they saw, and it ended up being a lot of fun that they actively played in this card game that was entirely based around chance. And for the character who was really good at gambling, I was palming cards off the bottom for him to give him better hands.
Which is fan goddamn tastic. You mentioned in the last episode, Dread does this for you with Jenga. It literally gives you Jenga and is like, this is how you play this game. And you're just playing Jenga. You're just doing it with a story around it. And there are board games, there are card games, there are dice games that you can just have your players play that are physically available or digitally available if you want to bring it up and I'll hop into a game room. There is a game where the game itself is kind of three-dimensional. I'm struggling to remember the board game. This wasn't in my notes. This is just something you made me think of, where it was a tower defense game. And that goes into fantasy RPGs 100% of the time. So having your players play that and kind of dummying up a little bit to tie in their player, their player character in the board game to tie in with their player character in the campaign is big. And you can use those tools without having to really get crazy with it or develop this whole concept of system of rules, because the board game already has the rules for you. Card game, poker in a tabletop game, poker just exists. Most people know how to play it. So you can just do that. And those kinds of moments where the physical players embody their characters and meet LARPing kind of halfway on that, just are they're memory moments for those players, and they make them want to come back because who knows what the shit you're gonna do next. On that,
I've made a whole LARPing career out of that exact sentiment. What the hell is that kind of guy gonna do?
Yeah,
next?
What are they gonna do that next? If you can, just get yourself a GM that LARPs, and then they'll put in so much more effort than your standard GM. Because they're used to it, because they have to do it for LARPing. So,
I'll throw one at you from LARP. My biggest hot sauce I ever threw into a game. I created a fully functional radio station for a game. So I got broadcast equipment that I broadcast on an FM wave that only really reaches the camp. I told the players, if you would like to listen to the in-game radio station, bring an FM radio. We'll put up signs on what you need to tune into. I then recorded hours of audio as basically a Three Dog style character, Wolfman Jack style character, and did this whole radio show that dropped a bunch of in-game lore without people having to read a book. And people listen to the station.
That's good.
And it's a future setting, so it was a classic rock station, and I basically just played rock and roll music from when rock and roll started to be a thing up until it's the station's tagline is rock and roll from its birth to its golden age, and I just pretty much just play all the music I like, and so it's partially selfish, but it's a lot of fun that people can come to the game and be like, did this dude actually hijack an FM wave for this? And I'm like, yeah,
I did.
Yeah, I did.
My other suggestions, again, outside of big splashy moves to add hot sauce to your games, that are kind of easy to do for anyone to do. And again, this is just sort of good storytelling 101, but it's absolutely doing something. You'll notice in any kind of pre-built campaign stuff where people are writing stuff for different systems that they have story beat characters and recurring characters and stuff like that they either pull from their player backgrounds or they pull from their world and what have you. Doing that, and this is such a simple thing, but it's so nice to do. If you have an NPC that's not an enemy, right? Or you have a character that you as the GM kind of return to semi-frequently, and this again works better for long-form campaigns than it does for like 1 or 2 shot kind of things. Get your character art in line for them, especially if they're a helping ally to the group, which is something I kind of want to go into because a lot of GMs don't do this, and I don't understand why. So you have this helping ally NPC, like this, not so much a Gandalf, but like a Gandalfian sort of role where they kind of come in and then they leave and then they come back and they leave and they really help the party out. And play with that character like you would in a story where they go off, they have their own motivations, they have their own things. They're not part of the player's narrative. They just kind of keep intersecting with them occasionally, and then let it lie for like 6 to 10 sessions, and then work them back in. And you can work them back in like a dire moment or like a complicated moment or a moment where they seem like they're going to be overwhelmed. And then you just pop the picture up on your monitor, on your laptop in the session, what have you, before you say anything. It's like roll a perception check or who's got above this score in awareness or what have you. And then just pop the picture up. The party attaches to things that can help it, or like maybe like a vendor that has good items for them to buy so that they can just get better shit, and stuff like that, so aggressively. And when you have a consistent character that you've built like a voice for and you've built like a background for that kind of comes up, it just keeps multiplying every time they pop back up into the campaign for a session or two or for an arc. Also, a more intimate version, and again, this is better for when we can all play in the same space, a more intimate version, but it can also work on a conference call. If you have a player that you play with, but they can't commit to a schedule, just bring them into the campaign for like 1-2 sessions, and then just keep bringing them back. And so then it's not even you, it's another player. You mentioned it, obviously, with the friend far from home over Skype, but when you tell your players nothing and then they see that person when they walk in the room, they get to anticipate. They're like, oh, Sarah's back, Mike's back, and they always play this character, or maybe they play a couple different characters and they don't know which one they're going to be in this situation. Maybe they play a villain. And so they don't know if it's like, fuck, are they going to be the villain or the ally? Are they going to be someone good or are they going to be that? Feel free to share your storytelling space that much, because what it does is it gives that person a thing to participate in. It lets players know that they can kind of bring those sorts of things up themselves, those sorts of like recurring things up themselves, and it homogenizes your campaign. It adds so much to it, and it doesn't require more prep time than like a normal game would be like if you're playing, like, especially if you're playing with a smaller party, if you're playing with like 3 or 4 people, adding a 5th player isn't that big of a deal. You're not fighting for narrative or talking or shining space, if you will. So that's a biggie. So pay attention to your NPCs. Give your NPCs players if you can. But even if you can't, there's ways to sort of like warm up the audience, similar to your Star Wars scroll, your beginning of the episode scroll, to kind of get people involved. It just really gets them excited to jump into the thing, whatever your next beat is going to be. I had a buddy of mine who used to do trailers, where he would. So what he would do is, in the in-between times after having the session, he would do trailers where they would be all kind of classic, in a world where these things, and they were always funny, and they took like a minute, and he would do slideshows, and that way he could, like, if you know that you might go into a dark cave and there might be a big monster, he could do like a silhouette of what the monster might be, or something like that, and really amp people up in the in-between. To kind of warm them up and prep them, and also prep the magic spell users for what they need to be aware of. Again, this was Just I think 3rd edition. So it was people that had to like prep spells for sessions and shit. So it gave them a little
what
bit of
components?
Yeah, what components do I have? What spells do I have on hand for spell slots? That kind of thing.
That's why sorcerers are the best.
They are, but in my next, if I do a D&D 5th edition as a player, I really want to play a wizard because I want to make every choice a nightmare for myself. And just be the softest little breakable boy that can just unleash hell. But yeah. So those are some simple things. Look online. We're not the only people that are saying things like this or telling people what are cool things they can do in their campaign. You can literally type this into Google or YouTube or Reddit, and you're going to find endless advice, pages of things to do where people expect people to just be like, just do this thing I did. Here's an idea I had. Go for it. Run with it. You'll find this kind of stuff. A little bit of research goes a long way in punching up a campaign from your own knowledge, and it's important. Also, if this is my ultimate hot sauce tip, and it's kind of a hard tip to give because it's kind of a taxing time tip. If you're going to run campaigns, if you're going to run stories, it's important for you to listen to other people's stories and campaigns, or read them, or read about them, or understand them. We all have television, film, novels, video games to pull from, and that definitely adds to the experience. But you're never going to get something that's more directly applicable to what you're doing than someone else's game. And so, much like a writer needs to read a lot of different novels and books, much like a director needs to understand film and film history before them, watch shit, listen to shit, read shit, like, enjoy all of those things, absorb that stuff, and then steal it and use it for your own campaign, and your players will think you're amazing. And no one will be mad. Nobody will be mad at that.
Use every idea I've given here, carte blanche. You can do it exactly as I did it, and I don't feel bad. So we're just about out of time, but I wanted to give one more suggestion before we go. And if you really, really, really want to wow your players, try playing on a sense that people do not normally play on. I had a GM, and I have always admired her as a GM because she used smells and tastes as a storytelling mechanism. We were going to, it was a high fantasy game, and we were going basically to this evil witch that had a gingerbread house. And she straight up made gingerbread cookies before we came over. And so the whole house smelled like gingerbread. And when we met the witch, she started giving us gingerbread cookies, that we physically ate gingerbread cookies. And it was just so enthralling. And still, even though the cookies were delicious, the house smelled wonderful, it turned into, to this day, I still get a little unnerved at the smell of gingerbread.
That's excellent.
She also would, she had a main villain who was this like Victorian lady. And so before the players would come over, she'd go into her bathroom and she'd take a handkerchief and just spray the shit out of it with this specific perfume that she didn't wear in a plastic baggie and seal it. And then wash up real good. We'd come over, and as soon as that villain would come out, she'd just pop that bag open and just put the little handkerchief out, and the whole room would start to smell like this perfume. And we all got very used to that smell. And sometimes she would even preempt her appearance by pulling that out very, very slyly and setting it next to her. And we just, oh no.
Oh God. Yeah, those moments. Think of what, if you were trying to do the ultimate entertainment event for children, start thinking in that mode, because it's not that we know as adults that we have a certain layer of attention span and interest and intrigue and depth diving that children don't necessarily have at their hands. But we never lose as people the sort of excitement that we get when things are added. Your sound effects, the idea of changing the lighting or changing the look or adding something bit more visual, or this most recent one, which is you're handing out cookies because the thing you're telling about is in a gingerbread house. That's the kind of thing, again, so many of these things are the kind of things that like a school classroom teacher for children would do to try and further engage them. And that,
fun fact, she was a teacher.
Of course. And it works. It works on adults. It works on adults every time. So no adult is going to be mad at you. They're not going to feel like they're being talked down to because you're just trying to engross them into the story. And it's things that we forget because we're so used to just reading books and watching media or listening to media and letting that be enough for us because we can focus on that one or two senses better as adults. But as children, you're trying to engross everything that you can, and those tricks just turn into just big ads because they map so wonderfully in a campaign, and they don't get done most of the time. And you don't have to do this every session, just sometimes. Just punch it up sometimes. Or you can do it every session if that's what you want to do. But just add to it and come up with games. That kind of thing.
Start small, or you'll set a precedent about doing yourself every time, which I ended up accidentally landing in on a sci-fi game to where I got to the point where I'm like, I don't know what else I can do short of spending some real money.
Yeah.
All right, so that's about all the time we have for today. This was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed getting back to my roots on these last couple episodes, talking about tabletop. And in 2 weeks, the folks get to look forward to even more of a deep dive into my roots because we're going to talk about LARPing. Whoa.
I don't know anything about LARPing. It's all just going to be questions. We're going to change the format of this where it looks like I'm just interviewing you for 2 episodes about LARPing and you just explaining things and me being like, that sounds exhausting and hard. So yeah, I'm very excited I've been excited to do this because I've been in tabletop so deeply for the last couple months, doing sessions weekly and stuff like that. So I was really glad you came up with these ideas, but I'm so excited to be educated by essentially a professional LARPer. I would say you're a professional in the way that you take it in a professional style and have done everything that a professional would do as a LARP creator and player.
Short of actually make money on it, I've done it all. Actually, a legal corporation and all that, but we'll dive into that later. So yeah, check out the show. You're listening to it right now, so you obviously know where to find it. But if you want to find the website, that's therolesweplay.podbean.com. We also have social media presence at facebook.com/therolesweplay. Hit us up there, give us show ideas, chit chat with us, comment on the episodes, or just say, hey, you guys are a couple of handsome fellas. I know I always like to be called a handsome fella.
Yeah, right.
What about this dying of exposure thing? Where are they going to find out about that?
Dyingofexposure.com. That's the main website. That'll get you everywhere. Social media, Facebook, Twitter is at dying of exposure at the end of it, or at dying of exposure. Instagram is dying_of_exposure. So is the Twitch with the underscores there. Tuesday nights through the mill. That's my homebrew tabletop campaign. That's 7:30 Pacific. We do it weekly. That's a Western fantasy using 5e and D&D for like monsters, classes, races, but everything else is homebrew. And then just follow us there. Episodes of Through the Mill will be in video form, usually around the same time that they come up on the podcast, but you should listen to them rather than look at us, because I don't do any like cuts or edits or fun gifs or anything. It's just us talking. It's just talking heads. So yeah.
Personally, I'm fine with whatever medium you want to consume the show. I'm just happy to be listened to. There's been a couple of people who've left very nice comments on YouTube, and I have seen those, and those make me happy. You have not scared me off yet, YouTube.
Not yet.
All right, I'm Ron for Steve and the Roles We Play. I'll play myself out.